is that history is not about truth. It's not about facts. We can look at what this is. That's what students of history, when they first come to the class, because that's what they think it's about. Is they just come in and learn the facts. And then send it back to the teacher and, get a grade and then move on to something that they learn. But if you really understand that history is about facts, what's it about? Now, I don't like the word opinion. Interpretation. Because opinion just can mean anything, right? But interpretation means that you are trying to interpret it as objectively as possible. But it still doesn't mean you're going to get to the truth. But an interpretation is based on fact, or at least the facts that you can ascertain. And opinion, I mean, I know people that talk about politics all the time, and they give their opinions, but they know nothing. Where does their opinion come from? Could be lots of things. But not based on any knowledge or anything. My son is perfect. I mean, he goes off on all this stuff about, why marijuana should be legal. Which is fine if he believes that. I don't care. I mean, I don't think it should be legal, but, if he believes that, that's fine. But he knows nothing. He's not studying things, he's not read the literature on both sides to try to figure out, why or why not there could be advantages or disadvantages. He can't list any pros or cons of why he would do it. It's just he wants to smoke pot. That's an opinion. He lives that. Interpretation is based on fact as much as you can ascertain them. And it's based on solid research and evidence. Opinion is not. And so in here, I'm going to ask you, what do you think about something? And then when I disagree with you and take points off, they're going to say, well, you asked me for my opinion. Remember, right now, I'm not asking for your opinion. I'm asking for your interpretation, which requires evidence. So if you don't give me any evidence, then you're going to get points taken off of that particular kind of question. But if you understand that history is not about facts, it's about interpretation, then for those of us that like to argue with people, that like to get into debates, that's what history really is. It's debating what is the best interpretation of an event. And it's looking at your textbook and trying to figure out where the guy's off his rocker. Where does his bias come in? Where has he not really supported what he says with fact? How can you make certain statements without giving you evidence to back that up? Instead of just taking it as if it's true. So, getting back to the two things I asked you to read on Lacasis and Zen, do they complement each other or contradict each other? What do you think? So they pretty much have the same opinion, right? And what is that opinion? First of all, what are they talking about?
They took over how they killed the Native Americans, they took over their land, they traded with them, and basically their attitude and how they greeted them.
Who's that?
The Spanish.
Okay, mainly it's referring to the Spanish, right? Especially, which one of them is only referring to the Spanish? Lacasis, right? Because he lived then. He's the primary source. He was alive, living on one of the Spanish colonies. And what was he? What was his role? What? He was a priest. He's sent there for what purpose? What? Yeah. The religion of love, right? Got to convince those Native Americans that they're heathens and savages and barbaric. They got to turn to Jesus to get saved and understand the religion of love. don't do it, we'll just chop off your head and cut off your hands and stuff like that, you know. Kind of interesting. It's a bit of a contradiction, isn't it? So here's Lacoste is there to, you know, win these people over, these poor savages that don't know the gospel, they don't know the truth. And so he's sent there to bring them Christianity. And what does he observe when he's there? What? In what way? Explain.
The Spaniards just completely killing off all of the Native Americans for no reason.
Lacoste himself sees the population of, you know, these Native Americans on this island just being completely wiped out. Now, from his perspective, is it through disease? What's it through? How are they being killed? What? For what reasons? What? But there wasn't really much gold there. So what was the problem? Well, a lot of it, that's what it seems to be, doesn't it? They seem to enjoy being able to just, you know, just treat these people like beasts. Well, if you read Lacoste's and read, like, even Columbus's journal, because Columbus left us a journal, and if we read his journal himself, you don't get much of a difference. I mean, Lacoste paints the brutality a lot more so than Columbus does, but in a lot of ways, Columbus's journal does not contradict Lacoste's. He doesn't, you know, go into, you know, cut off these people's hands and did this and this, but his attitude comes through in terms of lording it over these people and thinking them as being lesser, almost lesser than human. But Columbus, as you said, what made him believe that there was gold here? What? Yeah. Were there these huge gold, you know, rocks hanging from your ears? No, they were like little tiny, like stud kind of earrings, but they were gold. So that led him to believe that there was just gold everywhere. And so he sent the natives out to mine for gold. But the natives kept trying to tell him it doesn't exist. There's not a lot of gold in this area. But Columbus wouldn't believe them. And so they had quotas to go out. It wasn't just Columbus, I mean, it's Columbus and then those who came after him to go out and find a certain amount of gold. If they didn't find the gold, they would cut off their hands and let them bleed to death as a statement to the other natives, this is what's going to happen to you if you don't go out and find the gold. So they worked these people to death, doing something that couldn't even happen. And then when they didn't deliver what they expected from them, they were completely brutal to them. And then it became just sort of almost a game of, you know, we're the conquerors and you're the conquered and you just have to do whatever we tell you. But then also the disease begins to set in, because as you weaken them by working them so hard, and as you introduce them to diseases that they don't have immunity to, they're going to die off. So that was Columbus's experience, which Lacoste is a part of. But Zen, is Zen only talking about Columbus? No. Zen is the secondary source that lives today. And he has looked at Lacoste as well as Columbus's journal and other primary sources, and probably also other secondary sources. That's one of the things I didn't say before, is a secondary source is not just looking at only primary sources. But it tends to also look at other secondary sources of people that have already done research on this topic, and they've been looking at primary sources. So you're looking at their interpretations and kind of, sometimes when you we all know this, when you talk to somebody or read somebody else's interpretation of something, or just hear their side of the story, It makes you think of stuff that you didn't think of. You know, it's not that you agree or disagree, but it just is like, wow, I didn't even think about that before. So reading that helps you to bring some things into perspective. So a good secondary source, in their bibliography, you should see primary sources as well as other secondary sources that they have consulted when they're doing their research project. And that's what Zen does, except, what's the difference, I don't know if you know this, but there's a difference with Zen in terms of being a secondary source than just another kind of history book. Even in this book that you guys have, if you look at the very end of chapter 1, if you have your book in front of you, go ahead and find the end of chapter 1. And then we'll get to the rest of the page. This particular book, it bothers me because it doesn't do what I would like it to do. You know how I told you when you do your paper for me, you're going to have to use the Chicago Manual Style, which your book has the appendix in the back of it that shows you how to do that. Well, in a typical history work, at the end of the chapter, you're going to have either endnotes or in the middle of the chapter, you're going to have footnotes. They have that in this book?
Yes, it's all pushed through that.
What they call a monograph, a book that is on a specific topic, and it has the whole thing of footnotes or endnotes, and it has the bibliography in the back. And typically, the bibliography is going to be broken into two categories: the primary sources and the secondary sources. Zen is definitely a secondary source, but his book was written to appeal to the kind of general population, not to other historians. He didn't want it to be too scholarly to scare people off. So his book doesn't have the footnotes like you would typically get in a history book. So, you know, they're trying to make it, you know, easier for people to read, and I understand that, but at the same time, when you're going to make certain statements, you need the evidence there to back up what they're saying. Because I don't want you to read Zen and just assume that what he's telling you is absolutely correct. There should be points at which, if you read that chapter, that you would ask yourself, okay, what evidence do you have to support this statement? Because it's not always there. And when you're reading a history work, there's some good things about Zen, and that's why I use it. I mean, it definitely is more readable. It tries to get your attention, you know, by explaining some things to you that maybe other history books haven't gone into depth on. But if you were really trying to do a study of the Columbian Exchange, Zen would only be one of the things that you might want to look at. You'd want to look at something that does more with primary sources and actually gives you the footnotes and the evidence in terms of where they got the information. But when we speak of the Columbian Exchange, both of these authors are talking about it. And in this case, these two authors complement each other in the sense that they pretty much both have the same perspective of the Columbian Exchange. So to them, is Columbus a hero? Which, you guys are younger than me. You probably didn't grow up with the, you know, rah-rah, Columbus is the greatest thing since sliced bread, but I did. You know, we have started to correct that view. Because what Columbus introduced by bumping into the Americans was tragedy in terms of what happened to the Native Americans. And one of the key things that I always try to stress in my classes is the impact of the Columbian Exchange, the ultimate impact. And it seems to me that no matter how I try to do it, I still don't get the reaction from the students that I guess I want, which I probably should have a particular desire for a certain kind of reaction. But it disturbs me to tell people that, well, first of all, what was the population of the Americans from Columbus one thing to this? Of all the Americans, 13 million. There's a whole section in your book on what those numbers are. Well, that should just be North America. Mine is say that the population of the Americans, North, Central, and South America, could have been defined, well, actually, it could have been defined, but I go with the number of about 75 million people living. If not 75, at least 50. So 50 to 75 million people living in the Americas. What was the population of Europe at the same time? Same number. You know, I think we sort of have this idea that somebody had just asked you this on, who wants to be a millionaire or something, you probably would have assumed that Europe was a lot more populated. Because they were more established, they were more civilized, and for some reason that seems to make us think bigger. So therefore, they must have had tons and tons of people, and then there was just this, scattered population here in the Americas. But the populations could have been pretty close to even. So let's just say you have 50 million people. Those 50 million people, I'm sure, were all standing on the shore, day after day, looking out to sea, saying, "Oh, Columbus, where are you? Come find us. We're desperate without you. We're uncivilized. We're savage and barbaric. Please come and save us." Right? They had gone through the Black Death and they lost at least a third of the population. So by 1492, the population was recovered and they were back into the population upstream, but it was still basic. Yeah, they were absolutely able to from our perspective now, that's a good point, because we might look at it and say, well, the Europeans were actually more barbaric than the Native Americans. But when you come overseas, remember, Europeans were really big in clothes. They wore clothes and layers. It didn't matter if it was 95 degrees outside, you had 16 different layers on wherever you went. So you're used to being completely covered up, especially women. These guys come up, bump into the Americas, and what do they see? Bunch of naked people. That's just uncivilized. You just can't run around naked. Back when I was in Ohio, I had some friends, this guy was a pastor, and he and his wife they come from California, and we're kind of from that sort of that flower child, generation kind of thing, and they had 2 children. And they asked me over for dinner one day. So I went over there, and we were just grilling hamburgers outside in the backyard and stuff. And the kids were like 5 and 7. And I get there and I come to the house, pull out of the backyard, and the kids are playing out in the garden and all that stuff. And I was like, the kids are really little, like 2, you kind of like, that's going to make it, but they're like 5 and 7. And I was kind of like, uncomfortable. Don't know what you're forgetting. But then, the really weird part is that the little boy who was 5-year-old had one touchdown. And I don't need him, number 1. You said, just stop in the yard and just humans to their God. That's barbaric, that's savage. So it was easy for them to designate them as the savages, and then as soon as you do that in your mind, it justifies anything you want to do to them, because they're really not human. They're less than that. And they can use that as justification for everything else that they did. Now, one thing about the Columbian Exchange that really bothers me is that the word exchange, if you use the word exchange, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Trade. And that makes me crazy. Because this has nothing to do with trade. Columbus didn't jump off the boat with little bottles of smallpox and spotted plague and typhus and diphtheria and say, hey guys, what can you give me for? For the most part, it has nothing to do with trade. Trade generally implies a quality of exchange. At least, even if we know that what we're trading is that we're getting a better end of the deal. In both people's minds, they usually both think that they're getting a good deal, otherwise they wouldn't do the trade. This isn't about trade. It's an exchange in the sense of what, because anybody here remember that commercial? Two people walking down the street toward each other. They don't know each other, but they happen to be walking towards one another. One's eating a chocolate bar, the other one's got a jar of peanut butter. Sticking their finger in the peanut butter jar, and they're both really getting into the little treat. I don't know how many people walk out and check peanut butter jars. And they're so into their little snack that they don't see each other, and they bump into one another. And as they both get up after this exchange, they realize the party guy's chocolate bar is broken off and is inside the peanut butter. And so they're complaining, you've got peanut butter on my chocolate, and you've got chocolate on my peanut butter. And they both end up taking a bite. This guy, chocolate bar with some peanut butter on it, now this guy takes a piece of the chocolate out of the peanut butter, and as they both taste it, lo and behold, they both love the new little treat that they have just discovered, and now we have these peanut butter cups. Okay, neither one of them intended to trade their peanut butter for chocolate or vice versa. They bumped into each other, they collided, and this is what happened. An exchange took place that wasn't even intended. That's really what the Columbian Exchange is about. An exchange takes place just because two worlds bumped into each other, and one of those two worlds figured out they were strong enough and powerful enough to basically cause the other to be subservient to them. The Europeans took what they wanted. They did not trade for it. Now, of course, Columbus, when he first got there, was playing nice, and he gave them little trinkets for, much more important stuff. I mean, there was some initial kind of, let's be nice until you start deciding to chop their heads off. But for the most part, it's something about trade. The trade comes much later. And when the trade does come, it's not really trade with the Native Americans for the most part, it's trade with other Europeans. The Europeans who establish themselves here begin to trade with their countries that they come from. Now, there is a pretty major exception to that. What did some Native Americans get involved in trade with Europeans? Mostly up in Canada. Furs. Because the Europeans who came here figured out that to go inland, to be able to get the furs, would probably put them into very compromising situations because there's a whole lot more Indians inland. And so they figured out it would be better to establish relationships with Indians, let them go get the furs, bring them to them, trade for guns and things that they would want, and then the Europeans would then take the furs back to Europe. So that's a pretty major exception to that. But for the most part, the trade did not take place between Native Americans and Europeans. But the exchange did, obviously. Now, what are some of the major aspects of the exchange? What gets exchanged because of them bumping into things? Okay, let's just say disease. Smallpox being the most important, that's the right. Smallpox being the most important in terms of what wiped out the Native Americans. So, because the Europeans came here, now again, I don't believe they intentionally bottled the disease and carried it over to wipe out the Native Americans. Obviously, that was inadvertent. They didn't really think that just by coming here they were going to kill all of them. But in all honesty, I don't think we lost hope over it either. So disease is probably, and I think, you know, not everybody would agree with me, but I think, well, definitely the most drastic impact, and maybe the most important. Because if you do think there's 75 million here, some people would say as many as 90% of those people will write down. That's 68 million people. In 100 years. Within 100 years, the population may drop at least 50%, and that's probably low. In as much as maybe 90%. And in some areas, definitely. So, that's the part that I was saying before. I just think like, students become professional. It doesn't seem that, I mean, I don't necessarily expect you to start weeping in my class, but that should bother us. There is not another situation in all of history that even compares to what happened because Columbus bumped into this land. I mean, the Holocaust, we all know about the Holocaust, I mean, that's probably one of the things that you actually did learn something about in your husband. How many people died in the Holocaust? 6 million Jews and probably a couple more than other less desirable, so to speak. 6 million. Nothing. Compared to the Native Americans who died. In terms of mortality, I think what happened in the Holocaust will come very close to that. What some of the Spaniards did in Native America, sure. But in terms of numbers, there's nothing else. The only other event in history that even comes close is the flood. Where God only Noah and his family. And that was God who did. I mean, how can you argue with him, you know? But in terms of man, treating other humankind the way that they did, nothing else even compares. And yet, you know, the World Trade Center gets hit, and we're all ready to go out and kill any person who looks like they might be money. Right? How many people died in the World Trade Center? A little over 3,000. You don't mind 68 million people, so much shit like that. How many died in Pearl Harbor? 2,400. How many died in Vietnam? Right. A little less than it just bothers me that it just doesn't phase us. And I don't know how to, and now your students, I'm sure, walk around my class and say, typically you want it. But I just want people to just show me a flicker in their eyes. That's really a lot. And they didn't do anything to deserve it. So, yes, probably in my mind. But what else? What other aspects of this? That's probably, some people would even argue that that's even more of an impact than disease, because what they picked up in terms of agricultural techniques, but also the crops, was huge. Europe was nutritionally a pretty horrible place to live. Their foods did not give them nutrition to have a healthy life. Plus, they couldn't grow enough food to feed this now growing population, such as Black Africa. What they learned in terms of these new crops and these new techniques completely revolutionized European Africa. And in doing so, it set Europe on a whole different path, because the number one see, to us, we don't even understand this because there's McDonald's on it. But the number one problem of all civilizations is food production. If you don't have food, you can't feed people, they can't be healthy, they can't work, they can't end up having more children. So it was unbelievable, the impact that had. What else? Oh, for those of you that weren't here last week, you do not want to text messaging my class. Right? So, for those of you that weren't here, that's a huge no-no. Now, again, I probably said this last week, you're adults, if you're expecting a message, or if you get a message unexpectedly, and you feel like you can look at it to just make sure that there hasn't been some horrible event in your family, then I can understand that, feeling it out, taking a quick look. If you need to respond to that person, then just quietly get up and go to the classroom, but do not sit there and carry on a conversation with your phone in the house. Alright, so what else? Did any crops come here? Yes. That's probably, there were some crops that came here, but the crops didn't really revolutionize our agriculture. I mean, added some things that were probably nice, such as oranges. I mean, here we are in Florida, we had oranges before oranges came here. But the livestock was big. The horse, obviously, very important because it kind of changes the lives of some of the Native Americans here, the Plains Indians in particular. I don't know if you guys grew up on Westerns. My generation, I grew up sitting on the couch with my dad watching Don Wayne. The white guys were always good guys, and the Indians were always the savages. But they were always on horses, right? And they had all these beautiful leather saddles. Right. Indians didn't usually have saddles, they rode bareback. And they were great horsemen, right? That's all you ever saw in Western Indians. Indians and horses. I just assumed they sort of popped out of the womb on a horse. Right? They were always here, that's all they ever did. Well, they weren't even here. Well, they had been here a long time ago, but they didn't become extinct and they were brought back by the Europeans. So huge change. Plus cows, pigs, sheep. Talk about changing diet. That's the part that changes your diet, not so much the crops, but the additional meats that we brought. Plus dairy products and things like that. That's huge. What else? What did Lacoste do? Priests. So what did they bring? So Indians didn't have anything. The Europeans said they had no religion. In their minds, they were very religious people. Just solid. But huge impact bringing Christianity in, because, I mean, generally speaking, even to this day, those people in this country call themselves Christians, right? So that's a huge introduction of something that really has had a major impact on the development of our society. What else? Not necessarily that Columbus himself might have introduced, but that is introduced because of the beginning of colonization. Well, that would definitely be true. I mean, you're going to find out that when it comes to cultural stuff, I know nothing. But that's true. I mean, they would have introduced their own forms of art and architecture and everything else that if you are an aeronaut that's into that kind of stuff, you probably would go off on that. But not my area of expertise, and not even my area of interest. But you're absolutely correct. It is important. Huge. Because the Indians did not prove to be good slaves. Why? It's hard to be a good slave when you're dead. They just were not able to withstand the diseases and stuff, and they weren't great in terms of a labor force. But the Africans seemed to hold up better in the climate and against the diseases that were here. And so the beginning of African slavery, I mean, as early as 1502, which is only 10 years after Columbus, we started seeing African slaves over in the American colonies. And we'll talk more about that as we move through the semester. What did the Spaniards take from America? Besides crops. They did try to take slaves back to Europe. Again, didn't work. They generally died pretty quickly. They stopped doing that pretty quickly because they just couldn't last. But they didn't do well on their time. Something else. There would have been, I don't know exactly what crops and spices and stuff. I'm not sure exactly what they would have taken back, but I mean, that's all part of the kind of agricultural change. Well, and actually, let me just comment on that quickly, because corn, beans, and potatoes were three of the things that they took back, and those are all what we call staple crops, that even if everything else failed, it wouldn't be the greatest diet in the world, but you could survive. I don't know if you guys are probably familiar with the Irish potato famine. Keep in mind that before 1848 or before 1492, the Irish didn't even have potatoes. Once the potato was introduced, that became their staple crop, to the point that when the potato famine did take place, 1 million Irish people, now Ireland is not that big of a country, 1 million Irish people starved to death because of the potato famine. Literally starved to death in their own country because there was not enough food to feed them. 1 million people. Of course, the British colony and British trade would track anything. But we're missing a big thing here. What did they take? Gold and silver. Huge. If you looked at my notes, 181, I think, tons of gold. How many pounds in a ton? So how many pounds of gold is that? 362,000 pounds of gold. How many pounds of gold do you own? How many ounces of gold do you own? Remember, there's 16 ounces in a pound. But that's not even close to the number of tons of silver. Anybody pick up on how many tons of silver? 16,000 tons of silver. That is 32 million pounds. If I'm doing the math right, 32 million pounds of silver. And a lot of it's sitting out off our coast. I could sort of like it. Kind of great thing, right? Take all this gold silver back to us. What? Well, Native Americans didn't really care because they didn't use the gold and silver in the same way. To them, it was just decorative. It didn't mean anything, really. Well, yeah, that part was so good for them. But what did it do to Europe? We always think of it as being like this cool thing because they took all this stuff back there. But what do you do? What happens when you put that much wealth into the economy just sort of overnight? The inflation was absolutely destructive of their economy. Spain went from being at the top of the world, king of the mountain, to within 100 years, just toppled. And a lot of that was because who does the inflation hurt them? Well, what does inflation do to prices? Prices way up, right? So the normal things that you used to be able to afford yesterday, you can't afford anymore because your wages have gone up. The prices have gone up. Well, what class of people does that influence? The lower and the middle classes, right? Because the wealthy can still afford to pay those extra high prices. It completely decimated the lower classes in Spain. Well, the wealthy might say so what, but it's the lower classes that do all the work. They're the ones who are all the farming. They're the ones who are taking care of all of the stuff that needs to be done. You decimate the lower classes, you basically destroy your economy from underneath. So So the gold and silver actually ended up not immediately, but within 2 generations, possibly being the very thing that caused Spain to lose its power, to lose its place of the world. So those are some of the major aspects of the Columbian Exchange. A couple more minutes, so give me just a second here to make sure I forget anything. You guys have, because you're the hybrid class, you have notes here under Chapter 1, Native Americans and Columbian Exchange. There's a